I hope you are all doing well. In celebration of Jane Austen July and because I have finished my reread of all of Jane Austen's 6 novels, today's video will be a Jane Austen ranking in which I rank Jane Austen's novels from my least favourite to my favourite. This recent rereading of Jane Austen's novels started April last year with Northanger Abbey and finished this month with Persuasion. I was attempting to read them in the order in which she wrote them, but I messed that up a bit and read Emma and Mansfield Park the wrong way around, but I still kind of achieved what I was aiming, which was to see how Austen's writing progressed throughout her life. Jane Austen's stories have been a part of my life since I was literally 2 years old. When the 1995 BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice came out, my mum says that I was obsessed with it from the start, and it's been a part of my family to watch pretty much any Jane Austen adaptation and indeed any period drama adaptation that we can get our hands on. The reason I started rereading her novels was because I realized I had actually only read them all once many years ago, and my knowledge of her stories mainly came from those adaptations, which I have watched multiple times. So I really wanted to go back to the source and revisit the stories as they were originally told. The results are definitely a little bit surprising to me. There are some books that I've positioned in ways that I probably thought I would when starting out reading them, and then there are other books that have completely switched in my mind. So I'll first start off with Mansfield Park. This was an interesting reread because I've seen a couple of adaptations, but I haven't watched them a lot compared with adaptations of the other stories. I had a feeling this was probably going to be my least favourite of her books, and I was correct. But I still think Mansfield Park is a really fascinating book. I would say it's probably her most topical in terms of talking about events that were happening at the time that she was writing. Certainly its references to slavery. It probably has more of a discussion of class than any of her other books, in terms of contrasting Fanny Price's adopted family at Mansfield Park with her real family in Portsmouth. I think the main reason that I will never love this story is because I really don't like Fanny Price that much. It's extremely hard to make a character who is so good likable, because anyone who's that morally good all the time is always going to be kind of annoying. And I also dislike Edmund even more, and I certainly think that Fanny Price deserves so much better than him, though in a way what Fanny is getting at the end of the novel is not really a husband but a permanent home at Mansfield Park, which is really what the book is about in my opinion. So saying this is my least favourite is not saying much, in that it's still a fascinating read. It just isn't personally one that I love and probably won't revisit for some time. At number 5 I have Sense and Sensibility, and this was quite surprising to me that I didn't love this book. I realised I was definitely conflating my feelings about the film adaptation with Emma Thompson with the actual novel. For me, the story still remains one that I love, and I still definitely adore the characters of Eleanor and Marianne. It was the way it was written that really put me off, and it makes sense because this was Jane Austen's first published novel, and with having no idea how anyone would react to her stories, it's no wonder that she toned down her characteristic wit for this one. Again, the male characters in this I found quite boring, Colonel Brandon and Edward Ferrars, but then again the story is really less about the romance and much more about the relationship between the two sisters. And again, at the end of this novel, it's not exactly romance that the two women are rewarded with, but really just a safe place to call home when their own home life had been so disrupted by their relatives. It's a real shame that I didn't love this one because I still really love the story. I wonder how different the writing of this novel would have been if this had been one of the later stories that she published. At number 4 I have Persuasion. Out of Jane Austen's novels, this is the one that I think features the most descriptions of actual real life places. Austen is famous for barely describing the physical surroundings of her characters and puts all her emphasis on character and dialogue. But in this book we have the port town of Lyme, we also have the city of Bath, and the feelings that these places evoke in the protagonist Anne Elliot are quite crucial to the story in some ways. In a way, those locations are more memorable for me from this book rather than Anne Elliot herself. I think Persuasion is a really wonderful story and has just as many great characters as her other more well-known novels, but for me I found Anne Elliot a little bit dull. It was the kind of book where I really did enjoy it while I was reading it, but it hasn't left a hugely strong impression on me in terms of the characters or the romance. So again, I think I'm going to watch the 1995 adaptation because in that film I think Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth come to life a little bit more than they do in the book. At number 3 I have Emma. Emma is definitely my favourite Jane Austen heroine. I think she is her most realistically drawn character. The way that she can be so annoying and despicable to other people and yet you still can't help but love her is Jane Austen at the peak of her writing powers, I think. Because Emma is so well off and doesn't actually have to marry to get by in life, there's less of a sense of urgency in this book than the others, so it definitely is one where you are here to read about this collection of characters and laugh at all the silly things that they get up to. I think why this one is not higher on my list is because I found it a little bit long. Jane Austen gets a little bit carried away with her more unlikable characters, such as Mrs. Elton, who gets pages and pages of dialogue, which, as amusing as that can be, also gets the point across a little bit too well that she's a really annoying person. Mr. Knightley I found quite boring to read about, to be honest, but again, this book is less about Emma finding romance and is much more a coming of age novel where Emma goes through some self-growth and learns how to be a better version of herself. At number 2, I have Northanger Abbey. This was a relative surprise for me that I enjoyed this one so much. Maybe it's partly because I hadn't read Jane Austen for so long and this was the first one that I picked up and was immediately swept back into her world. You really feel the joy and fun that Jane Austen is having in parodying a whole bunch of things in this novel, not just the gothic romances of the late 1700s, but also all the ridiculous characters that she writes about. I enjoyed reading about every single character. I felt like I had met people exactly like these characters as well in real life, and of course Mr. Tilney is my absolute favourite Jane Austen hero. I said this in my original review, but he is absolutely a feminist. He talks about muslin in the way only a true ally could, and in a way I feel like this is Jane Austen's most relatable book. You can almost compare it to a book now about a young person going off to university. You have this young girl going out into the world, meeting a bunch of people for the first time and exploring her naivety and her growth as she becomes more experienced in the world. And at number 1 is Pride and Prejudice. I didn't think I was going to be so cliche as to love Pride and Prejudice the most, but there is a reason why it is her most famous novel and her most loved novel, because it truly is one of the greats. The characters are all so well drawn, the dialogue is so well written, and I realized that the BBC adaptation of this novel barely added any lines of dialogue. It's almost word for word taken straight from the novel. The structure of the story as well is so perfectly suited to a TV adaptation in a way, because it has such clear chapters in Elizabeth's life over the course of about a year. I think it's a book that is extremely well paced. I absolutely never got bored. There were no parts that dragged. The cast of characters is huge, and yet every single one is so memorable. If you're going to read one Jane Austen novel, it has to be Pride and Prejudice. It's probably the most fun you can have reading a classic, and there's no doubt that it's one of the greatest novels in the English language. If you've read all Jane Austen's novels, let me know your own ranking in the comments. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you soon. Bye!